The first time my sister asked to borrow money, I didn't even blink, and looking back now, that might have been my biggest mistake. I was 28 at the time, freshly promoted at my job, flush with the kind of confidence that comes from finally being able to afford both rent and sushi on the same weekend. My sister, Danny, was 25 and already floundering through her second eviction in under a year, her voice full of practiced helplessness as she explained how the system had failed her yet again. I remember standing in my kitchen, cordless phone cradled between my shoulder and cheek, a grocery bag in one hand, a bag of dog food in the other, as she sighed theatrically and said, "You're so lucky, Olivia. You've always had your life together." The irony of her statement, dropped so casually, made me pause. Because luck had nothing to do with the 3 jobs I'd worked through college or the weekends I gave up for overtime. But somehow, in my family, my efforts had always been invisible, while Danny's failures were framed as noble struggles, misunderstood brilliance, or just bad timing. Still, I said yes. Of course I said yes. I transferred the money to her account before the conversation even ended, telling myself it was just a little help, nothing serious, nothing I couldn't afford. That was 3 years ago. Since then, the little favors had snowballed into a quiet avalanche of sacrifice, each one chipping away at my patience and my bank account, until I could barely remember what it felt like to live without that constant edge of resentment tugging at the corners of my mind. The rent payments started first, usually a few days before the first of the month, cloaked in desperation and promises. "I swear, Liv, this is the last time. I'm just waiting for this job to call me back." But the job never materialized, and when I gently offered to help her polish her resume or suggested networking events, she'd scoff or ghost me for days. Eventually, I stopped offering anything besides money. It seemed like the only thing she actually wanted from me anyway. Then came the credit card debt, the collection calls she accidentally had redirected to my number, the pleading voicemails that always seemed to come when I was trying to enjoy a rare night off. "It's just so embarrassing," she'd whisper through tears. "They said they're going to garnish my wages, and I finally got an interview. Please, Liv." And even though every cell in my body wanted to scream this is not my problem, I found myself opening my laptop and logging into my bank once again. By the time the car situation happened, I was already burnt out from years of playing the unwilling benefactor in my sister's tragic one-woman show. My own vehicle was modest, a reliable sedan I'd paid off early with bonuses and skipped vacations. Danny had wrecked hers months ago after falling asleep at the wheel during a midnight Taco Bell run, and ever since then, she'd been borrowing mine. What began as the occasional ride to the grocery store turned into multi-day disappearances where I'd have to Uber to work and then back home again, only for her to return my car on empty, littered with iced coffee cups and cigarette ash. Still, when she begged me for the keys that morning, insisting she had an urgent interview, across town and no other way to get there, I handed them over. I remember standing in the doorway, watching her speed off without so much as a thank you, and wondering, not for the first time, how she had managed to make my generosity feel like an obligation. I went about my day, working from home in a quiet that felt unusually tense, checking the clock far more often than I should have. It wasn't until I got the call from the police that I realized just how far she was willing to go. The officer's voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, but tinged with something else, suspicion, maybe. He informed me that my car had been involved in a minor collision. No one was seriously hurt, thank God, but there had been some sort of altercation afterward. According to the report, Danny had accused me of stealing her vehicle. She told them I'd manipulated her into driving a car that wasn't properly insured, and insisted that the vehicle actually belonged to her. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. I even laughed, genuinely confused, imagining that maybe someone had stolen my car from Danny and was trying to cover their tracks. But the officer continued, explaining that she'd produced fake ownership papers and had been very convincing. He said they were still sorting things out, but that I might want to consult an attorney, just in case. I hung up the phone, my hands suddenly ice cold, and sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours. When I called my parents, desperate for support, for validation, for anything, I should have known better. My mom answered first, her voice sharp and irritated like I'd interrupted something important, probably her favorite reality show or an afternoon glass of wine. "Olivia, I don't know why you're being so dramatic," she said, brushing off my shock as if I were a child who had spilled milk instead of been accused of a crime. "Danny's just under a lot of stress. You do tend to make her feel inferior, you know. Always flaunting your success." And just like that, the trap of our family dynamic snapped shut again, cold and unyielding. I had bailed Danny out more times than I could count, and yet here I was, the villain in a story I didn't even know we were telling. But something inside me broke in that moment, or maybe it finally unclenched, a quiet resolve building where the hurt had always lived. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just nodded to myself, picked up a pen, and began making a list. Not of debts or expenses. I already had all those records carefully documented, but of plans. I was done being the family safety net. And the gift I was about to give them? Well, let's just say it would be unforgettable. It's a strange kind of heartbreak, realizing that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally have quietly rewritten the definition of love altogether. For years, I'd convinced myself that my willingness to help was a strength, a marker of maturity, of compassion, of what it meant to be a good daughter and good sister. But after the call with my mother and the barely concealed irritation in her voice, something inside me snapped. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in that slow, silent shattering you feel only when denial can no longer hold itself together. I wish I could say I confronted them all immediately, marched over to my parents' house and unleashed years of pent-up truth in a fiery storm of righteous anger. But the reality was much quieter than that. I sat on my couch that night with a single lamp lit, the room soaked in a dim amber hue, and I began pulling together every receipt, every bank statement, every Venmo screenshot that traced the timeline of my blind generosity. I wasn't just going to cut ties, I was going to do it with precision. By the next morning, I had created 3 folders on my laptop, one labeled Car, another labeled Danny, and the last one simply titled The End. In the Car folder, I placed all the documentation showing the vehicle's ownership under my name, registration, insurance, maintenance receipts, and even the dealership paperwork Danny had helped me pick up, years before her selective amnesia set in. The Danny folder held all the rent transactions I had made directly to her landlord, the ones she claimed had been gifts, along with the debt payments I'd funneled quietly to collection agencies on her behalf. Every time she had sobbed over the phone, promising she would pay me back, I had clung to that promise like it was a binding contract. Now it served as a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to my breaking point. But the end folder was the one that meant something more than logistics. It held my plans, my decisions, my freedom. And if I was going to walk away from this house of cards, I was going to set the foundation on fire as I left. The first thing I did was call my lawyer, Sasha, who I'd hired years ago to help with some freelance contract negotiations. Sasha was sharp, meticulous, and had the kind of laugh that made you feel instantly reassured, even when talking about worst-case scenarios. I explained everything: the car, the crash, the police report, the false claim Danny had made, and my parents' unsettling decision to side with her over me. There was no disbelief in Sasha's voice, only a calm steadiness that reminded me I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. I was simply done. "You've been more than generous," she said, after a long pause. "But they've mistaken your kindness for weakness. That's a dangerous mistake, and it's time to correct it." We started with the car. Sasha reached out to the authorities and provided the necessary documentation, proving beyond any doubt that I was the rightful owner. She also requested a copy of the dashcam footage from the responding officer's patrol vehicle, which captured Danny spinning a story so absurd it almost sounded rehearsed. Sasha sent that footage directly to Danny's insurance provider and filed a claim that placed the financial responsibility squarely on her shoulders. I didn't call Danny to warn her. I didn't text her some gentle buffer message, trying to cushion the blow. I let the truth arrive in her mailbox, wrapped in legal language and sealed with consequences. I imagined her confusion slowly giving way to panic as she realized the safety net she'd grown so used to had vanished overnight, not frayed, not worn thin, but sliced clean through. Next came the money. I had never formally asked for repayment, my mistake, I now realized, but I had detailed every transfer with excruciating precision. Sasha helped me draft a formal request for reimbursement, breaking down each transaction by date, amount, and purpose. The document was 16 pages long. I sent it in a certified envelope to Danny's apartment, with a copy forwarded to my parents' address. No note, no warning. Just math and facts, the things they had always ignored in favor of emotional manipulation and manufactured drama. The fallout came swiftly. Within 2 days, my phone exploded with messages from Danny. At first, they were peppered with emojis and fake concern. Hey, Liv, just got your little letter face with ears of joy, we should talk. I think you're confused. Then they shifted to rage, full of misspelled expletives and declarations of betrayal. I can't believe you would do this to family. After all I've been through, you're trying to ruin my life. I didn't respond to a single one. Instead, I blocked her number, saved the messages, and added them to the Danny folder. Sasha told me not to worry. If she tried anything further, we had more than enough evidence of her repeated misuse of my property and financial exploitation to press charges if it came to that. Then, of course, came my parents. My father was the first to call, a rare occasion, since he usually left the emotional work to my mother. His voice was clipped and strained, like he was forcing himself to sound measured. Olivia, this has gone too far. Danny is your sister. You two need to work this out privately. These legal threats are cruel. I let the silence hang for a moment before replying. You're right, Dad. It has gone too far. But I didn't start this. I just finally stopped letting it continue. He started to protest, some vague excuse about loyalty and how this is just what family does, but I cut him off with the kind of calm I'd never managed before. You've made your choices. You chose to ignore her lies. You chose to believe her stories. Now I'm making mine. That night, I sent one last letter. Not a demand. Not a warning. Just a formal notice, signed by Sasha, revoking my financial support in every form. No more bailouts, no more handouts, no more temporary help that always became permanent. It also included a copy of the invoice I had paid to repair the damage to my car, an amount Danny now owed in full. The quiet that followed felt different this time. Not like tension or dread, but like space, real, unburdened space I hadn't felt in years. And somewhere in that space, a new version of me was slowly starting to breathe. 3 days after I sent the final letter, the silence that had settled over my life began to fracture, not with apologies or reflection, but with fury masquerading as concern. It came in the form of a group text message from my mother, written as though it were a Sunday brunch invitation rather than a carefully orchestrated ambush. She wanted us all, me, Danny, and my father, to come over for a little family meeting, as if the mess we were in could be cleaned up with polite conversation and a plate of her overcooked lasagna. I stared at the message for a long time, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or scream into a pillow. The last time I had been at their house, I had stood in the living room holding a grocery bag filled with vitamins and a heating pad Danny had asked me to buy, only to be scolded for not picking up the exact brand she liked. That was the visit where my parents told me I was making things difficult by expecting Danny to return the car on time, the car she later crashed and claimed as her own. The idea of sitting at their table, smiling through clenched teeth while they gaslit me into believing this was just a misunderstanding, made my stomach churn. But Sasha, ever the voice of reason, advised me to go. Not to reconcile, not even to listen, but to observe. To hear what they had to say, document it if needed, and most importantly, to give them the final chance to either grow up or dig themselves deeper. So I went. I arrived 10 minutes early, because despite everything, punctuality was still stitched into my DNA like a badge of honor I never asked for but wore anyway. My childhood home looked the same as it always had, rose bushes trimmed just so, porch swing creaking softly in the breeze, and the same faded welcome mat that had greeted me for over 2 decades. But standing on that porch, holding my breath as I rang the doorbell, I realized something had shifted. The house looked familiar, but I no longer felt like I belonged inside it. My mother opened the door with a forced smile that was all teeth and tension. She wore pearls and perfume, like she was hosting a charity luncheon rather than a last-ditch intervention to salvage her fractured family. My father stood behind her, awkwardly adjusting the collar of his sweater, his eyes darting anywhere but mine. And Danny, well, Danny was already sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if none of this mattered at all. "Olivia, sweetheart," my mother said, gesturing for me to come in. "Let's try to talk like adults, okay? None of this legal nonsense. It's just family." I almost turned around right then and there. But I reminded myself I had walked into boardrooms tougher than this, negotiated deals with people who had far more power and far less humanity. I could handle my family for 1 hour. I could sit in this curated theater of civility and keep my voice even while they unraveled. As I sat down, Danny finally looked up, her expression a perfect blend of smugness and victimhood. "You really blindsided me, Liv. I mean, suing your own sister? For what, helping you be less boring?" She laughed, as if that was some sort of punchline. My father coughed gently, the universal dad signal for, "let's keep this civil," and my mother leaned forward like a politician about to launch into her stump speech. "We've talked about this, Olivia. You've always been so independent. So strong-willed. It's wonderful, really. But sometimes that strength can turn into stubbornness. You don't understand how hard things have been for Danny. She's had setbacks." Setbacks. That word hung in the air like a rotten perfume. Setbacks, like being evicted because she refused to pay rent on a luxury apartment she couldn't afford. Setbacks, like ignoring job offers because they didn't align with her creative vision. Setbacks, like weaponizing vulnerability to get what she wanted, then biting the very hand that fed her, in this case, mine. I took a deep breath and folded my hands in my lap. This isn't about setbacks. This is about accountability. She took my car, wrecked it, lied to the police, and then tried to flip the narrative. And you stood by her while she did it. Danny rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh my God, Liv. It wasn't that serious. I panicked, okay? I just didn't want to get in trouble." "That's exactly my point," I replied, my voice calm but cold. "You didn't want to face consequences. And you still don't." My mother sighed heavily, as if my refusal to accept Danny's lies was an inconvenience to her dinner plans. "We all make mistakes, Olivia. She's your sister. Can't you just forgive her and move on?" I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blouse with deliberate precision. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. And moving on doesn't mean letting someone continue to treat you like a bank with no boundaries. "I'm done." Their expressions shifted in unison, a ripple of disbelief followed by the sharp sting of realization. I pulled an envelope from my bag and placed it on the coffee table. "This," I said, "is a gift. Inside, you'll find a check for the exact amount I owe for the last family vacation we all took together, the one I paid for in full without being asked. Consider it my last contribution." My mother gasped, reaching for the envelope with trembling fingers. My father opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Danny just stared at me, wide-eyed, as if she'd only just realized I was no longer playing her game. "I'm giving you all the one thing I've never given before," I continued. "A clear boundary. You can choose to respect it, or you can lose access to me altogether. There's no in-between." Then I walked out, each step on their plush carpet echoing like a countdown clock to the end of an era. And as I pulled out of the driveway, the envelope left behind like a tombstone on a grave of broken trust, I didn't feel guilt or sadness. I felt something far rarer. By the time I reached my apartment that evening, the emotional whiplash of the family meeting had started to morph into something quieter, a kind of detached clarity that allowed me to replay every word, every sigh, and every incredulous glance with the precision of someone who was no longer afraid of the truth. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. Instead, I put my phone on silent, lit a candle in the corner of my living room, and sat down at my desk with a fresh sheet of paper. Not a metaphorical one, a literal one. I had things to write, and I wanted the weight of the ink to match the weight of the words that had finally taken root in me. For most of my adult life, I had been the fixer, the quiet, reliable backbone of our chaotic family dynamic. While Danny chased whims like they were oxygen and our parents spun narratives to protect her from consequences, I had played the part of the responsible one. It was a role that had started as survival and somehow evolved into expectation. If I didn't fix things, who would? If I didn't step in, everything would collapse. That belief had shaped my every decision until I finally stepped away and watched as the entire structure, hollowed out by years of enabling, began to crumble. The text started rolling in the next morning, as predictable as the sunrise. My mother was the first, sending a carefully worded message that looked like it had been drafted, revised, and probably reviewed by at least one of her friends from book club. "Olivia, I think you're overreacting. Your father and I were simply trying to keep the peace. We're not choosing sides. We love you both. Can we please revisit this conversation after emotions have settled? Maybe a family therapist could help us communicate better." I stared at the screen for a full minute, then let out a bitter laugh. The idea of therapy coming from my mother, a woman who had once scolded me for crying after losing a job, calling it unattractive behavior, was so wildly out of character it bordered on absurdity. And yet, even in that message, her refusal to name what had actually happened was loud and clear. No mention of the car. No mention of the police report. No acknowledgement of Danny's lies. Just a vague plea for peace, as if emotional accountability were something optional, a luxury that could be bypassed in favor of a smiling family photo. I didn't reply. Instead, I redirected my focus to something far more productive, reclaiming the parts of my life that I had put on hold while playing savior to people who saw my sacrifice as a given. The truth was, I hadn't taken a real vacation in over 2 years. My emergency fund, once flush with carefully saved bonuses, had been slowly drained by repeated loans to Danny that were never repaid. I hadn't bought new furniture, despite my growing dislike for the worn-out couch in my living room. I had postponed graduate school applications twice. And for what? For people who viewed my generosity as an obligation, not a gift. That afternoon, I made 3 decisions, each one small in its own right, but together they felt like a declaration. First, I booked a week-long solo trip to the Oregon coast, a place I dreamed of visiting since college. I didn't choose the cheapest room or the fastest flight. I picked what I wanted, and I paid for it without guilt. Second, I updated all of my passwords, revoked shared streaming accounts, and changed the locks on the spare keys Danny still had, just in case. It wasn't out of pettiness. It was about reclaiming physical and digital boundaries that had been ignored for far too long. Third, and perhaps most importantly, I scheduled a meeting with my financial advisor to restructure my budget around me, not my family's endless crises. I wanted to invest in myself for once, in ways that extended far beyond money. The backlash came quickly, as I expected it would. Danny posted a cryptic message on Instagram, one of those melodramatic quote graphics that read, "Some people will only love you when you let them use you." The caption said, "Tired of fake love disguised as support. Some sisters just can't stand to see you rise." I didn't respond, not publicly, not privately, not even internally. Let her followers believe what they wanted. Let the carefully curated comments pour in from people who only knew her highlight reel. I had spent too many years defending myself in silent battles no one else could see. I was done explaining. Let her talk. The next blow came from my father, and it hurt in a way I hadn't quite prepared for. He called late one evening, his voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. "Olivia, sweetheart," he began, "I know things got a little out of hand last time. Your mother and I were hoping you'd reconsider the whole repayment thing." Repayment. As if the 16-page breakdown Sasha had prepared was some unreasonable list of demands, instead of a detailed map of every penny I'd bled to keep Danny afloat. "You raised me to take responsibility," I said evenly. "That's all I'm asking of her." He sighed, that long, weary sigh I'd heard since childhood, the one he used when he wanted to guilt me without saying the words aloud. "This is tearing your mother apart." "She made her choices," I said. "Just like I'm making mine." He didn't try to argue after that. He simply hung up, the finality of it heavy but strangely welcome. And then, as if the universe wanted to punctuate my decision with poetic irony, I received a letter the next morning, a formal notice from Danny's insurance company. They had reviewed the evidence, including the dashcam footage Sasha had secured, and determined that Danny was entirely at fault. Damages would be her financial responsibility. I smiled as I slid the letter into a new file folder I had created, one not labeled with resentment or duty, but something far simpler: peace. Because in the end, that was the real gift I was giving myself, not revenge, not retribution, not even the satisfaction of being right. Just the unshakable peace that comes when you stop apologizing for protecting your own damn heart. There's a moment, quiet and almost imperceptible, when a shift in a relationship becomes permanent. Not loud like a slammed door or sudden like a shouted goodbye, but slow and unmistakable, like realizing a window has been cracked open for so long that the room has turned cold without you noticing. That moment came for me exactly 1 week after Danny received the bill from her insurance provider, the bill that I didn't send, didn't touch, didn't even mention, because I didn't have to. The truth had finally started doing what it always eventually does, unraveling the lies with more elegance than I ever could. Sasha texted me mid-morning, the little blinking dots on my screen filling me with more anticipation than I cared to admit. She'd just received confirmation that Danny was attempting to dispute the charges with her insurance company, claiming she was coerced into driving my car and emotionally manipulated by me in ways that compromised her judgment. Sasha's response, which I read with growing admiration, was a neatly worded rebuttal, complete with screenshots of Danny's original text messages begging for the keys, the police report, and the security camera footage from my building that showed her casually walking to the car, coffee in hand, with not a trace of duress. "We're not responding with emotion," Sasha had written to me. "We're responding with receipts. And when people like your sister are met with documentation instead of drama, they don't know what to do." And Sasha was right. Because just 2 days later, Danny switched tactics entirely. Her name popped up on my phone again, this time in the form of a voicemail, short, breathless, and laced with a panic I hadn't heard from her in a long time. "Liv, hey." So I didn't realize how serious everything had gotten. I just thought you were mad. Look, I don't want to fight anymore, okay? Maybe we can talk, just the two of us? No lawyers, no insurance people. Just sisters. I didn't respond. Not because I was trying to punish her, but because the request came too late and from a place too calculated to be called genuine. For years, I had begged for that kind of conversation, one-on-one, honest, sister to sister. And every time, she'd either brushed it off, deflected, or turned the tables until I was the villain in a story she hadn't even bothered to understand. Now that the scaffolding of her deceit was starting to collapse, she wanted to pretend we were building from scratch. But I had no interest in rebuilding what I had already dismantled. It wasn't just Danny who was unraveling either. My parents, clearly rattled by the way I had stopped answering their calls and returned their guilt-laced letters unopened, decided to escalate their discontent into something more public. The next Sunday, during brunch with my friend Meredith at a quiet cafe downtown, I received a group email, this time not from my mother's phone, but from her desktop email account, the one she used for holiday newsletters and annual family updates. She sent to second cousins and former neighbors. The subject line read, "A letter to our loved ones, the truth behind the rift." Meredith raised an eyebrow when I showed her my phone screen, then took a long sip of her mimosa. "Oh no, your mom's gone full PR campaign, hasn't she?" I nodded grimly and opened the email. It was everything I had expected and less. A carefully curated narrative that portrayed me as a distant, ungrateful daughter who had forgotten her roots, abandoned her struggling sister, and allowed external influences, read Sasha, to cloud her judgment. The tone was so saccharine it practically oozed from the screen, dripping with passive-aggressive jabs disguised as concern. There was even a sentence that read, "We hope Olivia remembers the warm childhood home that raised her, the one she seems so determined to erase." The house. Always, it came back to the house. The two-story beige stucco I grew up in, with the rusting mailbox and the creaky screen door. The one they still lived in, the one I had helped pay the property taxes on for 2 years straight when my father's pension was frozen and my mother's side business never took off. The same house I had spent countless weekends cleaning, fixing, and filling with groceries when they claimed they were a bit behind this month. That house was being used as a prop now, a symbol of their sacrifice and my supposed betrayal. What they didn't mention in that email was the equity loan they had quietly taken out using my name, back when I was 22 and too naive to understand that co-signing a document, just to help with the approval process, would turn into a long-term financial leash. They didn't mention the late payments that had dinged my credit, or the extra interest I had to cover just to keep my score from cratering. They never mentioned the emotional IOUs they'd cashed like clockwork, the guilt, the comparisons, the guilt again. I didn't respond to the email. I simply forwarded it to Sasha, who replied within minutes. Every time they try to go high drama, we stay low documentation. Let me know when you're ready to move forward with the last step. And I was ready. The final step wasn't legal. It wasn't financial. It wasn't even about Danny or my parents. It was about me, and it was going to take place at the one place I hadn't been in almost a year. The house. I drove out the next afternoon, pulling up to the curb with the engine running and the windows rolled down. The house looked the same, but not. The paint was more faded than I remembered. The garden was half-tended, as if someone had started caring and then lost interest halfway through. And the porch swing, once my mother's pride, had a slight lean to it, like even it had grown tired of playing along. I didn't go inside. I didn't even knock. Instead, I walked up the path, placed a sealed manila envelope on the welcome mat, and took a single photo of it with a timestamp. Inside was a copy of the equity loan release form I had signed the previous day, the one that transferred all remaining ownership of the house back to my parents, with zero remaining obligation for me. Sasha had arranged everything. Legally, financially, spiritually. As I walked back to my car, the wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves and tugging at the edges of my coat. I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because the house may have remembered me. But I no longer needed to remember it. There's a silence that comes after a long storm, not the empty kind that feels like absence, but the full-bodied kind that feels earned. That's the kind of silence that settled over my life in the weeks after I left the manila envelope on my parents' doorstep, the one that ended every financial tie they had to me, and with it, the last remnant of the role I'd been coerced into playing for far too long. I didn't expect applause or gratitude, and I certainly didn't expect understanding. What I got, instead, was something much rarer, peace so unshakable it felt like a second skin. At first, I braced for retaliation, the kind of backlash that had become second nature in my family, where manipulation often masqueraded as concern, and where silence was weaponized more cruelly than shouting ever could be. But nothing came. No dramatic phone calls. No more group emails. No late-night drive-bys or long letters filled with poetic guilt. It was as if they'd all finally accepted that I had closed the door, and this time, I wasn't leaving it cracked for a reconciliation that would only lead me back into the same cycle. The timing couldn't have been more poetic. Just days after severing the final financial ties to my family, I boarded a plane to Oregon for the solo trip I had booked, the trip that had been sitting like a promise in my inbox, waiting for me to believe I deserved it. As the flight ascended, the city I had known my whole life shrank beneath me, not just in size, but in emotional weight. I watched it disappear under the clouds with a calm heart and a clear mind, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer tethered to anyone's expectations but my own. The ocean met me with the kind of grace I hadn't realized I needed. Mornings were wrapped in mist and the scent of salt, my windows open to the sound of waves rather than demands. I walked barefoot along the beach with coffee in hand, watching dogs chase gulls and children shriek with laughter. No one knew me there. No one expected me to fix anything. No one was waiting to see how much of myself I'd give away just to keep the peace. In that space, where no one could reach me, I began to rediscover things I hadn't even realized I'd lost. I remembered that I loved painting, something I hadn't done since college, because it was always too messy or too indulgent to be worth my time. I remembered that I loved slow breakfasts and long walks with no destination. I remembered what it felt like to read a book all the way through without interruptions or the weight of unfinished business hanging in the back of my mind. I remembered how loud and beautiful my own thoughts could be when they weren't constantly being drowned out by someone else's crisis. It wasn't just a vacation. It was a reclamation. And when I returned home, not to the house I grew up in, but to the life I had built myself, brick by brick, without fanfare or applause, I found that the silence had followed me in the best way. My phone had fewer messages. My mind had fewer worries. And my heart, once a place that carried too many people who gave too little in return, now felt lighter, more spacious, like it had finally been cleared for something better. There was one message waiting for me, though. An email from Danny. Just one paragraph, a confusing blend of passive aggression and attempted grace. She wrote that she hoped I was finding whatever it was I needed so badly, and that family will always be here, even when you turn your back on them. There was no apology, no ownership, just a carefully coded reminder that in her mind, I was the one who had betrayed them, not the other way around. I stared at it for a few minutes, letting the words settle like dust on a windowsill I no longer needed to clean. And then I did something that took less effort than I thought it would. I deleted it. Not archived. Not saved for later. Not screenshot and sent to Sasha for safekeeping. Just gone. Because I was done collecting evidence of who they were. I didn't need proof anymore. I had my peace, and that was all the proof I ever needed that I'd made the right choice. The months that followed became a quiet season of rebuilding. Not from the ground up, because I wasn't broken, but from a place of deeper self-awareness, because I had finally learned that boundaries weren't cruel. They were compassionate, not just toward myself, but toward the version of others I had once enabled. I joined a local art co-op and started painting again. I restructured my work schedule to include regular breaks that weren't filled with errands or calls from Danny. I started therapy, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to learn how to live in wholeness, without apology. And perhaps most significantly, I started writing again. Journaling at first, scribbling through the quiet hours of early morning with tea in hand and my dog curled at my feet. But then it became more than that. Essays, reflections, stories built from the ashes of experiences I had once tried to forget. It was like the words had been waiting all this time, buried beneath obligations and noise, finally free to surface now that I'd cleared the space they needed to breathe. People always ask if I ever heard from them again, if Danny ever truly apologized, if my parents ever came around. The answer is no. Not really. They exist now in the periphery, distant and dim, like a town I once visited but would never return to. I hear about them sometimes through mutual acquaintances or social media whispers. Danny's still Danny. My mother still hosts holiday brunches. My father still calls me stubborn in the third person. But none of it touches me now. Because I've learned something that I hope every woman learns eventually, that you're allowed to walk away from people who refuse to grow, no matter how intertwined your histories may be. You're allowed to protect your joy, even if it means others feel uncomfortable with your boundaries. You're allowed to say no, even and especially when you've spent years saying yes. And you're allowed to give your final gift in silence, not wrapped in revenge or drama, but in the kind of stillness that says, I am no longer yours to hurt. That, I think, is the quietest kind of power. and it's the one I choose every single day.